Yesterday, I posted the following tweet. Numbers 31 describes Israelite soldiers slaughtering Midianite civilians and seizing Midianite virgin girls, many of whom would be 12 to 13 years old, for their soldiers. This is no different than Boko Haram. Don't let evangelical apologists gaslight you. The one thing I would probably tweet there is it's probably not many would be 12 to 13 years old, but certainly it's a reasonable assumption. Let's say 13 to 16 years old. I think the most of them would have been that age, right about the age of puberty and in the post-pubescent stage. So early to mid-teens. That would have been the age of the girls seized by the Israelite soldiers. Now, somebody responded to my tweet by linking an article by Jonathan McLatchie titled, "Does the Bible Support Sexual Slavery? An Analysis of Numbers 31, 15 to 18. And I'm going to link Jonathan McLatchie's article below. As well, I'll link the article that I then wrote in response to his article, which I titled, "When Christian Apologists Defend Kidnapping Girls." In this video, I want to talk about my article in response to McLatchie's article, in part in due recognition to the fact that probably most people who follow my YouTube channel are not regularly following my blog. And so to make you aware of what I talked about in my blog, I'm just going to talk about it here. So first of all, I think very highly of Jonathan McLatchie. I respect him. I debated him and two other panelists, I believe it was Richard Howe and James White, on the topic of apologetic methodology 2 or 3 years ago, something like that. So I respect Jonathan, and I think this is a well-written article. I also think that it shows the glaring problems with a standard evangelical defense of biblical passages pertaining to violence, sexual ethics, and issues like sexual consent. And that's what I want to talk about. I think that McLatchie is in a similar place to somebody like Paul Copan, who also struggles mightily to close the gap between our contemporary moral intuitions and practices and the described behaviors and practices within portions of the biblical text. There is a chasm between the two, and people like McLatchie and Copan attempt to close the gap, and I don't think that they succeed. And I want to talk about that here. So, first of all, let's consider the way that McLatchie refers to the kidnappees, those that are kidnapped. In the passage in Numbers 31, Moses states that every woman who has been with a man should be killed. Now, the word translated woman, nekabah, can be translated as female, as woman, or as female child, depending on the context. However, typically it's translated here, so far as I can see, as woman, sort of as a generic catch-all phrase. But in verse 18, when Moses turns to the fate of the kidnappees, not the ones that are to be killed because they're not virgins anymore, but rather to the ones that are to be kidnapped because they are still virgins, here the language changes. This is the verse as McLatchie himself quotes it: "Save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, the term every girl, there are actually two words there, isha, taf. Now, isha, taf, those are two nouns. Isha is woman, and taf is a word for female child, like a little girl, right? Well, there are two basic ways that isha, taf is translated in verse 18. The first is to see these two nouns as a catch-all for every female virgin within Midianite society, and that group including some individuals who are adults and some who are girls, who are children. So if you read the King James Version, for example, all the women children that have not known a man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Or in another translation, the DRA, and by the way, I've got all these verses from the Gateway Bible, right, on the website, which very handily would line up, like 2 dozen or 3 dozen English translations. The DRA says, "But the girls and all the women that are virgins, save for yourself." So we have girls and women. But so far as I can see, the much more common translation of the passage of these two words is to see that taf is modifying isha, So it's telling you if woman or female, a particular kind, it's the childlike kind, it's the child. So that the kidnappees are then described as being girls rather than women and girls. So here are some sample translations. The CSB says, keep alive for yourselves all the young females. CEB says all the young girls. CJB says, but the young girls. The AMP says all the young girls. The HCSB says all the young females. The ICB says save the girls. The JUB says all the female children. The NASB says all the girls. NLT says the young girls. And the NIV says save for yourselves every girl. To sum up, the majority opinion, so far as I can see, is that the text should be translated as and understood to be specifying that in particular, the targeted group that the Israelite soldiers should kidnap for themselves are virgin girls, not women. So it's always possible that there were some within the group that were women who happened to be virgins, but the vast majority would be girls. And by girls, we're thinking reasonably. We're not going to look at prepubescent. So the text is not clear on what happens to prepubescent girls, right, who are presumably virginal, but dealing with pubescent and post-pubescent girls. So 13, 14, 15, 16 years old. Those are the people that are being kidnapped by the Israelite army. Now, as an aside, McLatchie never considers, and frankly, I haven't seen others considering, how the terrified Midianites, girls, would go about establishing or proving their virginity to the satisfaction of the Israelite soldiers. Could the process have included, for example, a gynecological exam? Now, the mind shudders at the thought. Imagine having to subject yourself to a gynecological exam in order to prove that you are a virgin and thus to escape being killed by Israelite soldiers. Yet something like that potentially is the framework of what we're talking about in this passage. While the vast majority of persons who would have been kidnapped would have been pubescent and post-pubescent teenage girls, when McLatchie refers to them in his article, when he refers to these kidnappees, he never once refers to them as girls, even though that is the very language of the translation he cites, which specifically refers to them as girls. The very translation McLatchie cites in his article refers to them as girls. But when he refers to them, so far as I can see, a total of 10 times in the article, he always refers to them as either singular woman or plural women. I don't know why McLatchie misrepresents the age of the kidnappees, but it is hard not to conclude, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I cannot say, that McLatchie misrepresents the age of the kidnappees as a way to ameliorate the moral problems presented by the text. Admittedly, it is horrifying to imagine a 24-year-old woman being kidnapped after she has just witnessed her family being massacred. But it is arguably even more horrifying to imagine that same heinous fate being inflicted on a 14-year-old girl. And yet that appears to be the framework with which we are dealing here. Now, the second issue that I want to address is the concept of rape itself and the related concept of sexual consent. I find that Christian apologists, people like McLatchie and Paul Copan, who I mentioned earlier, often fail to grapple, it seems to me, with the actual substance of the rape charge here. They're thinking about rape in some overly restrictive sense and then conclude that because the text doesn't obviously present rape in that restricted sense, that there is no forcible sexual contact that is implied by what is described in the passage. And I think that that's just manifestly in error. The central issue can be put like this. Can a 14-year-old child who just witnessed her mother, her father, and her brothers butchered in front of her, can that 14-year-old girl meaningfully give consent to a matrimonial institution and to sexual relations with one of the men who just butchered her family? we can frame the question in terms of the concept of psychological safety. The concept of psychological safety refers to the state of well-being in which you believe you will not face punishment or humiliation or repercussions for expressing your views, including your willingness to consent to an activity or your unwillingness to consent to an activity or to a relationship or to an institution. Do you think that a child who just witnessed her family slaughtered would have the psychological safety within that context with respect to the people who just slaughtered her family to feel comfortable to refuse the request for marriage and sex with one of the killers who had just slain her family? Just think about that. McLatchie cites the fact that the child would be given a month to mourn her family before presenting himself as a suitor to her, before the soldier would present himself as a suitor. But does anybody really think that a child who is given a month to mourn is going to have the healing required to experience genuine psychological safety and thus be able freely to exercise the ability to consent of her own free will, or if she chooses, to freely withhold consent from the offer of matrimony and sex? You can put this in context like this. Let's say that 30 days ago, this 14-year-old girl witnessed her father being disemboweled in front of her. She saw her mother beheaded. She wailed in terror as her two beloved younger brothers were impaled on spears. And as her father lay on the ground, fumbling in confusion with his own intestines spilling out, as her mother's severed head was still blinking in muscular spasms, her brothers gasping for breath, squirming on the end of a spear as blood bubbled up in their throats. In that situation, she is now pulled away by a soldier. And 30 days later, that same soldier comes to her and asks for her hand in marriage. Well, hey, it's been 30 days. She should be healed by now, right? She should have the psychological safety to be able to withhold free consent from a matrimonial institution and sexual contact with this soldier. I mean, the suggestion just boggles the imagination that somebody would make that kind of claim, and yet that is implied by McLatchie's argument. In the article, McLatchie also cites Israelite legislation against rape, intending to show that the Israelites took rape seriously. So this is a way to say, hey, you can't accuse the Israelites in Numbers 31 of setting up the conditions for children to be raped because they had legislation against rape. But here's what McLatchie says. According to this text, which is Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 to 27, the crime of rape is so serious that it is punishable by death. If the woman failed to scream for help when she was in the city and could be heard, the Jewish law viewed the situation as consensual sex rather than rape, since the woman could have cried out for someone to rescue her, but didn't. Thus, both parties were guilty. Frankly, this sounds to me like what we sometimes colloquially call a self-own. McLatchie is citing this passage as a way to inoculate or protect Numbers 31 against the allegation of rape by showing that there was legislation against rape within ancient Israelite society. And yet, this very passage he appeals to shows a completely inadequate understanding of the concept of sexual consent and psychological safety. It has the opposite effect from what he intended. Rather than calm our concern that the children might have been raped, this text merely places a spotlight on the grossly limited understanding of consent in ancient Israelite society. According to the legislation to which McLatchie appeals, if a woman doesn't cry out while being raped, or a child, a 14-year-old child, doesn't cry out while being raped in a populated area where she could reasonably be heard, she is considered a willing participant who should likewise face punitive judgment. No consideration is made for such basic facts, such as the very reasonable possibility that when she is being pinned down, when a hand is being placed over her throat, when a knife is being held up to her face, that she has become too terrified to cry out, that she has become utterly immobilized by fear and terror, and simply cannot even think to vocalize a cry that may not be heard by others. Far from addressing our concern, Deuteronomy 22 merely highlights the utter inadequacy of ancient Israelite understandings of psychological safety, sexual consent, and rape. What we have in McLatchie's article, well-intentioned though it may be, is functionally a defense of kidnapping children and then marrying them out and setting up the conditions for their psychological terrorism and for rape because of their inability reasonably to consent to sexual contact, given the complete inadequacy of any psychological safety within that horrifying power dynamic of killer to the aggrieved child. Now, this may have been the understanding of ancient Israelites, but McLatchie is not an ancient Israelite. He is a 21st century Christian apologist, and he should know better.